Welcome to Listenwise News Bites, where you can hear stories from the news that are specially selected for young listeners. I'm Monica Brady-Meyerov, a public radio reporter and the founder of Listenwise, an award-winning online listening resource used by teachers. We have a curated collection of more than 2,000 podcasts from sources such as NPR and other producers of high-quality audio storytelling. In this episode, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that employers may not discriminate against workers for being gay or transgender, and protest racial injustice from your car. Also, we learn what a bull with an itch did to one town in weird news. First, a story about a court ruling that protects people on the job who are gay.
7 years ago, Gerald Bostock lost his job. He was a child welfare services coordinator in Clayton County, Georgia. He says he was fired after it became known that he played in a gay softball league. Yesterday, the United States Supreme Court vindicated Bostock. Interpreting long-standing law, the court said employers may not discriminate against people for being gay or transgender. Bostock spoke with All Things Considered last night.
This is the moment that has made every step of that 7-year journey worth it. You know, looking back, no regrets at all.
The 1964 Civil Rights Act bars discrimination on the basis of sex. The court says that language protects people who identify as gay or transgender. The majority opinion was written by Neil Gorsuch, an appointee of President Trump. So how big is this ruling? NPR's Jeff Brady says the ruling changes the following stark reality.
Nearly 5 years ago, the Supreme Court made it legal for same-sex couples to marry everywhere. But more than half of states don't offer protection on the job, so a person could legally get married one day and fired the next.
The justice system is finally seeing and hearing what we have known and suffered all along.
Among those celebrating is Noelle Kankey. In 2013, she was pursuing her religious calling as a music director at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. She also was preparing to marry another woman. Kankey says she was asked to keep that secret, something that became so painful she considered suicide. Eventually, she chose living openly over her job.
Having to decide between those two things was so incredibly painful. Even when cleaning out my office, like I left the things in the trunk of my car for a year. I just couldn't even take them out of my car.
St. Joseph's denies Kankey's discrimination claim, saying the school is committed to offering an inclusive environment. Kankey is pursuing her own discrimination lawsuit. Her attorney believes this Supreme Court ruling will make it easier to win that case. The Williams Institute estimates there are 8.1 million lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people in the U.S. The organization says about half of them live in states with no LGBTQ employment protections, though some municipalities have passed their own ordinances.
We have a patchwork of civil rights laws in Pennsylvania.
Adrian Schenker directs the Bradbury Sullivan LGBT Community Center in Allentown, Pennsylvania. He says that patchwork was difficult because an employee could be open in one place but not in the next town over. He says now everyone, everywhere, is protected on the job.
I'm thinking about the next generation, the generation of LGBTQ youth who, when they enter the workforce, now it's something that they won't need to think about. They won't need to wonder if they can take a job in a municipality that doesn't have a non-discrimination law.
The future also is on the minds of religious organizations that argued against expanding the definition of sex to include LGBTQ people. They argue the government shouldn't interfere in the decisions of religious employers. Galen Carey with the National Association of Evangelicals points to religious colleges for an example.
There may be concerns that such colleges will either be forced to change their beliefs or possibly face risk of loss of funding, student aid, and so on.
Carey says it would have been better for Congress to take up the issue of employment discrimination, not the courts. Tim Schultz with the First Amendment Partnership says this ruling leaves unanswered questions for employers.
These questions of dress codes, locker rooms, bathrooms for transgender employees. The court specifically said we're not addressing those today And so those are frequently employment-related questions, and they remain unresolved.
Legislation in Congress could address some of these questions. They'll certainly be the subject of future court battles. But for LGBTQ people who've long feared they could be fired, what's most important now is that they finally have basic employment protections. Jeff Brady, NPR News.
Imagine having to give up a job you love to marry someone you love. Now that won't happen with this court ruling. Have you ever felt that you could not be yourself in certain situations, or that you had to give up something you'd like to do so that you can fit in? Next, a story about how people are finding a safe way to protest during the pandemic.
Now, some people want to join the nationwide protests against racism and police brutality, but the risks of the coronavirus pandemic keep them from marching. One solution: caravans. From Salt Lake City and Tallahassee to Kentucky and Wisconsin, people are demonstrating in cars, trucks, and minivans. NPR's Camila Domonoske heard from protesters during a recent caravan of cars.
Surya Kishi Grover has taken her 6-year-old to street protests in San Francisco. They maintained social distance, but her toddlers?
With an 18-month-old and a 2-year-old, they're not following directions that well.
In this caravan, the whole family could pile into the minivan with signs like Asians for Black Lives.
No justice, no peace. Abolish the police. No justice, no peace.
Elsewhere in that caravan, also recording her protest for NPR, was Fran Culp, who has medical issues. Elena Fong was driving and cheering too. Her daughter is immunocompromised. Editor and local business owner Erin Fair organized this caravan. She'd never done that before, but she had just followed an activist group on Instagram who posted about a Zoom call with tips on how to plan a protest. She wanted to offer a safer option during this pandemic, and after attending protests in downtown San Francisco, she also wanted to bring that energy into quieter neighborhoods like hers.
To be so close yet live this very peaceful, kind of unbothered existence was bothering me.
Fair planned a 17-mile loop through San Francisco, and inspired by the activists on that Zoom call, she told herself that 5 or 10 cars would be a success. A lot more showed up. Chloe Jackman's photography studio is along the caravan route. She watched for 2 hours and could still hear the honking when she went inside.
This was probably 1,800 cars. It was unreal.
That story was from NPR. This sounds like a safe way to protest racism and brutality. What other forms of protest allow people to express themselves while staying safe during a pandemic? Now it's time for some weird news. Let's hear how a bull with an itch to scratch caused a big problem for a town in Scotland.
Good morning, I'm Steve Inskeep. When hundreds of homes in a Scottish town lost power this month, residents might have suspected a downed tree or wind, but the culprit was Ron, a bull suffering from what his owner Hazel describes as an itchy bum. Hoping to scratch the itch, Ron rubbed against a utility pole, knocking out a transformer box. Hazel says her beloved bovine is oblivious, but she's thinking of renaming him Sparky.
Thanks to our partner, NPR, and to Scott Holmes for our theme music. That's it for the Listenwise News Bites podcast this week. For more stories from the news selected for young listeners, go to www.listenwise.com and sign up for free. And subscribe to this podcast for our weekly shows. Happy listening.